Sadiq Khan's team were always expecting this to be a tight fight. The reason primarily is the changes to the way in which we vote. And of course, you reported on the fact that Boris Johnson fell foul of that and ended up being turned away from his local polling station because he didn't have his photographic ID. And that was one of the things that there was evidence to suggest was going to impact Labour voters particularly badly in London.
Local elections, results are still coming in. We'll have them, of course, on Times Radio throughout the day. From what we've seen so far, what's your big picture reaction?
Really, it's in the words of Theresa May once, nothing has changed.
You have to say it twice. I would say. Nothing has changed, nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it kind of tells us what we already knew, actually, which is there's obviously trouble afoot for Rishi Sunak's government. He's obviously lost many of those local election seats, pretty much in line with what we had expected. In fact, Thrasher and Rawlings, the renowned local election experts, did a piece for us 10 days ago when they predicted the Conservative Party losing about half of their council seats, and that seems to be coming to pass. And also, I think what it shows is that there is no kind of slam dunk here for Labour, although actually I think some of the coverage has been slightly unfair to the Labour Party in that I think they are actually picking up seats in those local election areas that were picked up by Tony Blair when he was just before the 1997 landslide. So actually they are making inroads in those areas that they need to win. And I'm sort of slightly surprised whether this is kind of expectation management, because obviously Labour don't necessarily want us to be all writing that it's a rout, because they want everybody to think that there's, it's all still to play for ahead of the election. But I think in the kind of cold, sober sort of moments after this, I think if you actually look at the results, it has been a very good night for Labour. Yeah. They perhaps haven't done as well in the mayoralties as perhaps we were expecting, with Houchin hanging on to his seat up in the north. And of course, we don't know the results in the West Midlands yet. Yeah. But I think it is pretty much as expected.
On London, we're expecting a result in the London mayoralty election this afternoon, I think about 2 o'clock or 2:30 or thereabouts. There's a lot of sort of whispering that Sadiq Khan might not be as far ahead as people thought he was going to be, and all that kind of stuff. If Susan Hall were to sort of pull it out of the bag here, bearing in mind this is a woman who, yesterday, in the reporting about the mayoralty election yesterday, I saw that even some Tories were describing her as Psycho Susan. If she was to pull this out of the bag and win, that'd be pretty remarkable, wouldn't it?
It would be pretty remarkable. And in fact, it's so remarkable that I would put quite a lot of money on it not happening.
Right.
I don't know where these whispers are coming from. I, like you, have been party to them. There was a big sort of whispering round that was reaching the ears of pretty much everybody in the lobby yesterday, suggesting that Sadiq Khan had lost. I've spoken to people inside the camps. Everybody is saying to me, they don't understand where this is coming from. There's been no official nod or unofficial nod in any direction about how tight this can be. Look, Sadiq Khan's team were always expecting this to be a tight fight. The reason primarily is the changes to the way in which we vote. And of course, you reported on the fact that Boris Johnson fell foul of that and ended up being turned away from his local polling station because he didn't have his photographic ID. And that was one of the things that there was evidence to suggest was going to impact Labour voters particularly badly in London. The other thing, obviously, to bear in mind is the people within the donut that have obviously been vociferously against the ULEZ introduction, and people nodding towards whether or not that's going to be enough to inflict a punishing result on Sadiq Khan. But given the fact that he was 20 points ahead in most of the polls that have been done in recent weeks, it would be remarkable. But look, they were saying to me only a couple of weeks ago that they still thought it would be under a 5% margin between them, and could get even narrower than that. They were not expecting to win by much more than that as a sort of victory. So, when you're dealing with those margins, of course, there's going to be anxiety and nerves about what could happen if there's low turnout or if it rains or, yada, yada, yada. There's a multitude of reasons why people don't necessarily go out and vote in the locals. And obviously, another one being that people often register protest votes in a way that they don't at general elections. So there is a kind of degree of uncertainty about what could happen in London. But as I say, again, I would be extremely, extremely surprised if, as some of your sources described, Psycho Susan ended up stealing the day.
Wow, yeah, indeed. So look, I mean, to sort of to wrap it up, then, Rishi Sunak, is he safer or less safe than he was on Wednesday? Because one does get a sense that there seems to be sort of sort of, I don't know, this sort of like bleak unity coming from Tories, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, we reached kind of peak febrile moment probably about a month ago when there was all the talk about the right wingers, uniting to try and orchestrate a coronation of Penny Mordaunt as leader. And that was the kind of peak moment of madness, in my view, when, there were relatively sensible people within the party saying, we've got to roll the dice again because things are now so bad that actually anything would be better than this. Certainly this week, that wasn't the sense that I was getting. In fact, even last week, that wasn't the sense that I was getting, even though there was yet again talk about the plotters having a grid of terror for the Prime Minister, yada, yada. So, yes, it's remarkably quiet on that front. And I think that the fact that there was kind of a threat that potentially if things got really bad, the Prime Minister would call an early general election has actually been quite effective in cooling some of those hotter heads, as it were, in that most of them, will be looking for new jobs, potentially at the time of an election. Why would you want to sacrifice maybe an extra 2 or 3 months' salary
Well,
while you look for that next post? I mean, it's a little bit self-defeating. And so I think if that was a genuine threat and they thought that was going to happen, I think it has actually had an effect for them.
wow, I mean, yeah, what a sort of, I guess, unexpected outcome. Turning to Labour, there's this sort of bubbling sense that, although it might not have been decisive in many areas, Gaza and their policy on Gaza has impacted the Labour vote, particularly in areas with a high Muslim population. One would expect probably in areas with a high student population as well. What does this mean for the party? Are they likely to talk a different language? Is there likely to be something of a sort of like an autopsy on this? Or do the people in the centre of the Labour Party think actually if they were saying anything different on Gaza, that might do them more harm?
I think it's really difficult. I think it's a really thorny subject for them. I mean, look, they will absolutely be looking at these results. They will be having a forensic look at what happened in those seats that they ought to have won and didn't. Certainly, they'll be looking at the West Midlands vote, which is where we've seen suggestions that the Muslim vote may have not turned out in the numbers that they'd hoped for the Labour Party. And they will definitely be considering what they can do to perhaps turn that round before a general election. I think actually what's more likely, given the whisperings that we're hearing coming out of the Middle East this weekend, is actually the optics around what's going on there may change dramatically before we get to a general election, which will obviously be helpful to the Labour Party if there's a sort of further resolution on this. There's been a natural tension between obviously being supportive of Israel, given the terrible atrocities of what happened on October the 7th, but also that juxtaposed with the absolutely horrific humanitarian crisis that we've seen unfold in Gaza. And that's obviously stirred up, a lot of very strong emotions in seats which have a strong Muslim population. But as I say, I think one of the things that will happen is just the politics will be different at the time. But I think that won't also stop the Labour Party from looking at their own response and their own policies in this matter.
Yeah, I'm sure that will continue to be very, very interesting. Turning to reform. Was this a good election for reform? It's funny, one gets the sense that it wasn't particularly good for reform because they don't seem to have had any obvious breakthrough. And yet they do seem to have impacted the Tory vote quite strongly in some areas.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to use a local election set of results to look at reform, partly because they don't stand in that many seats, which means that you get kind of anomalies in terms of what that looks like in terms of national vote share. So I wouldn't draw too many conclusions, actually, from the local elections in terms of reform. I mean, the obvious thing to look at in terms of this was the Blackpool South by-election result, which obviously saw the Reform Party outperform its polling effectively. They've always been polling around 11%. I think in Blackpool South it was more like 17%, which is obviously a good result for them. And they came within 115 or so votes, I believe, of actually catching the Tories up. So in that respect, the Tories will be looking over their shoulder because obviously that could have an impact if that's repeated at a general election. And eat into the Conservative vote share. And, the message that the Tories have been putting out subsequently is if you vote Reform, you basically vote for Labour. And so, it's definitely been a kind of mixed set of results for them. But as I say, I don't think we can draw too many conclusions from this particular set of results.
Leaping north of the border, were it not for the local elections, the big political story of the week would, of course, have been the resignation of Humza Yousaf as First Minister in Scotland. We talked about that, in fact, this time a week ago, when it was pretty obvious already he was going to go.
Yeah.
What happens now?
Really good question. I have to say I haven't followed, because we've had so much going on down here. I haven't followed it with as great an interest as perhaps I might have done. But as I think we spoke about last week, I think the major ramifications for any change of leader up in Scotland, a bit like they would have been with Westminster had they have rolled the dice again down here, is that people will look at it, think it's not particularly stable. It's obviously had the change of leadership from Sturgeon to Humza had a big impact in terms of the support for the SNP and led to a spike in support for Labour. And I think that will only continue with the further kind of turmoil that we're seeing north of the border.
Okay, well, look, one more before I let you go. Bubbling background story this week seems to be the asylum fight with Ireland. Where basically it is claimed by both sides that the Rwanda policy has led to more asylum seekers crossing from the UK to Ireland on the basis that Rwanda won't affect them there. And this seems to have kicked off this sort of like almighty fuss that, as ever, we'd be paying more attention to if there wasn't so much other stuff going on. Is this going to be a big headache for, and if so, for who?
The thing is, there's so many things about the Rwanda policy that are a headache,
right.
That it's sometimes quite difficult to work out which one's going to become the biggest headache. As you so rightly said, yes, really interesting story. Obvious that, people that are here who are obviously going to be scared of being deported to Rwanda are either going to disappear. And let's not forget that scoop by Matt Dathan as well earlier in the week, which suggested that a lot of those people that have been detained here waiting for this legislation to go through, which took 2 years, have disappeared in the meantime. That's almost self-evident that would be what would happen. But similarly, obviously, if you're very close to another country and we've got very easy access routes to Ireland, people are obviously going to find other places to go. I guess part of the Westminster response to that will be, well, great, they're not here.
Yeah.
They're not our problem anymore, which is why we've seen the row over the kind of returns agreement
Although
and whether we'll agree to one.
I'm not sure that helps them if they're just because they leave, because they're still coming. So it means that the boat numbers can go up, and even while immigration overall goes down, and even though the policy might be working, they still don't get any credit for it.
But the overline headline figures, if they're disappearing off our headline figures, then it will obviously be a policy that's working, because we can point to figures that say that the numbers are going down.
But even if the numbers are going down, and we've got like 80,000 crossings when we used to have 40,000 crossings, that doesn't look like a glorious Rwanda success.
But there are so many difficulties with this. Are we really going to deport, the tens of thousands of migrants that have arrived here in the intervening period between when we stated this was going to be the policy and indeed the royal assent of the bill? Is there really capacity in Rwanda for 50,000 people? I'm told there isn't. Do we have the logistics in place to transport that number of people? I'm told there isn't. So if you're a migrant wanting to cross over the channel because you want to find a better life and you're thinking, but I might end up in Rwanda, you might also see the reports which suggest that actually you might just end up being part of, a huge number of people that are waiting for deportation. And I think that under the current projections, it would take something like 200 years in order to deport the number of people that are already here waiting to go, even if we started deporting, hundreds a week.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Caroline Wheeler. You can, of course, read more from Caroline in the Sunday Times.